All right, let's dive into this. For a lot of folks, the very first big question mark about the Catholic faith comes straight out of a really famous Bible verse. You shall not make for yourself a graven image. I mean, read that, and suddenly those incredibly ornate churches and marble statues start feeling, well, kind of suspicious, right? So today in this explainer, we are unpacking a really fascinating story about two teenage friends. And we're going to use their conversation to answer a surprisingly simple question. Does Scripture actually condemn what Catholics do? Or have we just been hyper-focusing on one single verse while totally missing the rest of the story?
So picture this scene with me. We've got two teenage friends, Daniel and Lucas, and they're just hanging out, spending the weekend together. Daniel is Catholic and his buddy Lucas is Protestant. The setting is Daniel's home. It's quiet. You look around and there's a crucifix hanging on the wall, maybe a small statue of Mary sitting nearby, and a Bible resting right there on the table. And as Daniel kneels down to pray, Lucas is just watching him. He doesn't say anything, but his face completely gives away this mix of intense curiosity, a little bit of tension, and just a distinct uneasiness. Because right in front of him, he is witnessing something that goes against the grain of his entire religious understanding.
Fast forward to Sunday morning. The boys decide to go to Mass. Picture the inside of this church. There's this massive altar, a really prominent crucifix, statues of saints flanking the sanctuary. The whole congregation is kneeling down and responding in perfect unison. Afterward, as the sunlight is just spilling across the front steps outside, Lucas kind of slows down. He actually turns and looks back into the church, right at the crucifix, right at the statues. He is deeply thoughtful, but you can tell he is clearly uncomfortable with what he just experienced. Later that evening, the air in the room is just thick with all these unspoken questions. They're sitting at a table, two Bibles sitting right between them, and Lucas finally, but very carefully, speaks up. He admits, he was really uncomfortable at church, and not because of Daniel, but because of the statues, the crafted images, the kneeling. He's hesitant because he really doesn't want to accuse his friend, but he feels like he has to ask. Because in his mind, the Bible offers a strict, absolutely undeniable warning against this exact practice.
So Lucas slides his Bible over to Daniel and asks him to read Exodus chapter 20, verses 4 and 5. He points to it and says, "Look, it says right here, you shall not make for yourself a graven image or any likeness of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath. You shall not bow down to them or serve them." Lucas points out that this right here is exactly what bothered him so much. I mean, on the surface, that seems like a pretty open and shut case against the Catholic Church. But Daniel, he doesn't get defensive at all. He just calmly slows the conversation down because he wants to define the terms. He asks Lucas to look really closely at what God is actually forbidding here. He asks him, does it say, "You shall never make images"? Lucas rereads it and kind of realizes, well, no. It specifically says not to bow down to them or serve them as gods. And that's where Daniel clarifies this absolutely vital distinction. The commandment forbids making images to worship them as idols. It actually doesn't forbid making images entirely.
And that distinction brilliantly sets up Daniel's next point. He hands the Bible right back and asks Lucas to read just 5 chapters later, Exodus 25:18. Lucas starts reading, "You shall make 2 cherubim of gold on the mercy seat." You can imagine Lucas stopping, completely surprised. Wait a second, God actually commanded the making of statues? Daniel firmly nods and explains that yes, cherubim are heavenly angels. God literally and explicitly commanded the creation of physical images of heavenly beings. And get this, not just for background decoration. These were for the Ark of the Covenant, literally the holiest object in all of Israel. Just to lock this whole thing in, Daniel points over to the New Testament. He has Lucas flip to Hebrews 9:5, which specifically mentions the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. It's the exact same ark, confirmed right there in the New Testament. Think about how heavy that is. If all physical images of heavenly things are strictly 100% forbidden, then God basically contradicted himself by commanding these specific statues to be built. It really forces you to completely reevaluate that very first Exodus reading. But hey, Lucas is sharp, right? He brings up the ultimate counterexample. He says, okay, if images are fine, why in the world was God so furious about the golden calf? Daniel calmly turns to Exodus 32:4 to explain exactly why. You see, when the Israelites made that calf, they didn't look at it and say, hey, this beautifully reminds us of God. No, they pointed right at the gold and said, these are your gods, O Israel. That right there is the literal definition of idolatry. It's replacing God with an object, rather than just using a representation to honor him. So let's actually look at how this builds across salvation history. Daniel starts walking Lucas through this undeniable pattern of God-ordained images. We've got the cherubim on the ark in the 15th century BC. Then, if you look at Numbers 21, God commands Moses to make a fiery bronze serpent and set it up on a pole so that anyone bitten by a snake who just looks at it will live. I mean, wow. God is literally using a crafted physical image as a direct instrument to heal his people. And just to prove this isn't some quirky Old Testament thing we can ignore, Daniel shows how Jesus himself confirms the saving use of this exact image. Over in John 3:14, Jesus says, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Jesus is directly aligning his own upcoming crucifixion, the ultimate act of salvation, with that physical, crafted image of the bronze serpent. Then, Daniel brings the conversation to this really huge turning point, the temple in Jerusalem. He explains that God himself gave the exact architectural pattern to David, and second, this God-given design specifically included carved, beautifully engraved figures of cherubim and palm trees all over the walls, so angels from heaven, plants from the earth. And third, which is really the ultimate stamp of approval, Jesus Christ himself entered this very temple. He taught there, he prayed there, and he literally never once condemned the sacred images covering its walls. As the evidence really starts to pile up, Daniel offers this absolutely crucial warning about how we approach reading the Bible. He points out that every single verse in Scripture is explained by the verses before it and the verses after it. No single verse just stands alone in a vacuum. In 2 Peter 1:20, we are explicitly warned that no prophecy of Scripture comes from someone's own interpretation. When we isolate one single line, like that prohibition of graven images, and we just completely ignore the rest of the context, we can weaponize the Bible to make it say almost anything. To really drive this point home, Daniel sets up what is basically the climax of their whole discussion. He points out the absolute greatest historical example of someone quoting the Bible completely accurately, word for word, but entirely out of context. Someone who took the literal truth of the text, but used it to try and construct a massive lie. That someone? Well, it was Satan. In Matthew 4:6, right during the temptation in the desert, Satan tells Jesus to throw himself off the temple, and he quotes Psalm 91 perfectly. He will command his angels concerning you. It is 100% real scripture, but Satan weaponized it by isolating it. Daniel firmly concludes that when one verse is pulled out to condemn something that the rest of Scripture clearly permits, the problem isn't the Bible at all. The problem is our isolated interpretation of it. Experiencing what is honestly a massive paradigm shift, Lucas looks up and just quietly says, "You know, I really thought Catholics ignored the Bible." And Daniel just smiles a bit and replies, "We just read all of it." And guys, that is the absolutely crucial takeaway for us today. Whether we're examining art, statues, or complex theology, the question isn't just what one isolated verse says. It's what the entire cohesive library of Scripture tells us when we read it all together. It definitely leaves us with a pretty provocative thought. How many other beliefs do we hold tightly onto based on a single, isolated verse? And what might we discover if we just zoomed out to read the whole story? Definitely something to think about.